Good afternoon, Sergeant Pluger.
Good afternoon, sir.
Thank you for being with us today. A few questions that I had to follow up on with you. When a police officer under your command uses force, are they required to immediately notify you?
It depends on the type of force.
Okay. Are there certain circumstances where you may get a phone call or a radio dispatch immediately?
Yes.
Are there certain circumstances or situations where you may get a phone call or a report of a use of force within 10 to 15 minutes?
Yes.
Are there circumstances where you may get a use of force report or from an officer from an hour or two later?
Not one that would cause me to have to go to the scene. That would be more immediate. They'd want to let me know right away because I need to get out there and interview the subject.
Right. But it could happen within more than, say, 10, 15, 20 minutes that you get that notification.
Yes.
It would be fair to say that in certain types of use of force, there may be other, or use of force cases, there may be other activities that the officer needs to do after the use of force. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
So they may use force against suspect number one, but then they have to apprehend suspect number two, for example, right?
Yes.
And they've used force on number one, but they get number two detained and it takes some time, then they call you, right?
Yes.
Or, for example, an officer may use force on someone, conduct some additional investigation, whether it be interviewing witnesses or gathering evidence, and then call you to report the use of force, right?
Yes.
Is there a policy within the Minneapolis Police Department that requires an officer who uses force to do that through dispatch channels?
No.
They could call you on your cell phone.
Yes.
They could send you a text.
Yes.
Basically, their requirement is that they need to reach out to you and say, hey, we need you to come to the scene, right? We use force. Now, just a second. Showing you Exhibit 221, Policy 5-306 regarding medical assistance. What do the first four words after medical assistance read?
As soon as reasonably
Practical, right? Oh,
Yeah,
I
that's
said
fine.
four. Ha! Sorry, you got me. As soon as reasonably practical, right?
Correct.
An officer has to use or render medical assistance as soon as is reasonably practical, correct?
Yes.
Now, are you familiar generally with the Minneapolis Police Department's critical decision-making model?
Somewhat.
Essentially, when a police officer is engaged in a situation, would you agree that an officer is constantly taking in new information, processing that information, comparing it to what happened before, and making decisions based on information as it comes in?
Yes.
And information as an officer is dealing with the situation can change, right?
Yes.
And that information that they take in may change or modify the behavior in response to the situation, right?
Yes.
In this particular case, when you arrived on scene, you initially spoke with Officers King and Lane, and Mr. Chauvin was present in that scene.
Yes.
And he was listening as Officer King and Lane told you what had just happened.
Yes.
Now, when, in your experience as a police officer, when a supervisor's use of force, well, strike that. When one group of officers goes to a scene and a second shows up to assist, whose arrest is that? Is it the original officer or the assisting officers?
Should be the original officer.
And so when you're reviewing a circumstance, is it going to be would it be your policy to talk to the arresting officers or the assisting officers first to find out what happened?
I guess I wouldn't care one way or the other. Whoever wants to tell me the story.
Okay. And if one officer is responsible for it, you're going to go to that officer, right?
Right.
And if two officers, you're going to ask them both.
Correct.
And if all of the officers are standing around and they're talking about it, that's what you need to do initially, right?
Correct.
Now, you were discussing again in this particular incident, you were at, when you arrived on scene, you asked, you kind of gave some direction to these officers, right?
Yes.
And at the point that you arrived on scene, you knew it was a use of force incident, but it was not what you call a critical incident. Agreed?
Agreed.
Because at that point, Mr. Floyd, to the best of your knowledge, was still alive.
Right.
Speculation.
If you know what the answer to that is.
One more time, sir.
At the point that you were initially on scene, you had no information that Mr. Floyd was deceased, right?
Correct.
Now, you then instructed the officers to do a few things, right? Potentially talk to witnesses, and then two officers to go down to the hospital with you.
Yes.
In their squad car.
Yes.
All right. And we saw this video where you instructed Officer Chauvin to try to get some witness statements, things of that nature, right?
Yes.
And he made the comment that he would try, but the crowd seemed pretty hostile.
Yes.
Officer Chauvin and Officer Tao ended up at the hospital with you,
They did.
and Officer King and Officer Lane remained on scene, right?
Yes.
At some point when you learned that Mr. Floyd had died, the use of force review was no longer reviewed by you, correct?
Correct.
Someone died, well, and I believe even per policy, if someone was a use of force occurred